It's always a shame when a game manages to get something so right, but others so wrong. Overborder Studios' Thymesia is a great example of this, with satisfying high-energy combat that rewards patience and a familiarity with its admittedly narrow progression systems. But its twisting tale about a plague-torn kingdom and the secret operative that can save it, as well as the inconsistent quality of the exotic locales it takes place across, are largely half-baked and easily forgettable. Thymesia's story follows Corvus, a generic but well-dressed royal operative who's had his brain scrambled like a breakfast egg. That's likely the consequence of his direct involvement in a plague spreading across the country, empowering some creatures while maiming, killing, and mutating the rest. With the help of an underwhelmingly cryptic lady named Izmi, you must climb into the dark, goopy void that is your memory to remember how you got here, in hopes that you can find clues on how to undo this tragedy. I really like this story setup to start, but I couldn't have cared any less about Corvus's mysterious purpose by the end of the roughly 8-hour journey. This is partially due to there being surprisingly little dialogue and very few NPCs to pry information from, with most plot points delivered through notes dropped across the maps that aren't written in a very compelling fashion. The fact that the story is based in a conspiracy swirling around magical blood that turns people into monsters doesn't help Thymesia shake the Bloodborne clone allegations either. Corvus's memories take place in 3 locations. 2 of them, the Sea of Trees and Hermes Fortress, are largely bland environments that you've probably seen done in other games before, and likely better. The foggy plague swamp of the former features lots of rope bridges and tree houses that look so alike under the putrid haze, it becomes hard to navigate. The latter is just a medieval fantasy fortress, dilapidated and casting a shadow on some sparse forest areas around it. The swamp, at least, has the occasional scary hammer-wielding mutant to spice up the journey through it, but the fortress is packed with generic night enemies of various stripes, with no real visual or thematic surprises to be had. The mundanity of these stages is far more dire when compared to the third area, the Royal Garden. It's genuinely one of the most interesting environments I've seen in a game like this, taking you from twisted greenhouses down to a library submerged ankle-deep in blood. Each stage has subquests that are technically optional, but the things you find when you complete them are essential to figuring out how to end the plague and fix the world. You could absolutely beat Thymesia by completing only the main missions, but the results might be lackluster. There are several different endings you could land on based on a few factors I won't spoil, and I would have been motivated to see them all if you didn't have to repeat the final boss every time to do so. Especially when the only thing that really determines the ending, besides having the right items and information, is how you choose to use them after the final fight. And in reality, even the good ending is a bit of a disappointment, as it plays out in a simple slideshow of inky images with some sparse text blocks. Despite the story's shortcomings, Thymesia's combat is its main highlight. Corvus moves swiftly, smothering his enemies in a barrage of blades and dipping out of range just before they can counter cleanly. There's no stamina bar to contend with here, meaning the limiting factor to your attacks is simply the length of a combo string, similar to a fighting game. By default, there's no blocking either, meaning your go-to defensive option is either a parry with pretty tricky timing or a reliable dodge. Deflecting an attack sends damage back at the attacker at a decent rate, making every little encounter a choice between passively waiting out an enemy's series of attacks and striking during the downtime, or being proactive, absorbing the damage with a well-placed parry to soften them up before it's your turn to strike. Combat is largely a back and forth like this, since there's no reliable way to stagger enemies. They can be staggered, of course, but how and when almost always feels like a crapshoot, and unpredictability also shared by when baddies decide to counter you. Apparently, there are a limited amount of attacks you can freely land on an enemy before they will counterattack, but you're never actually told exactly how many that is, even though you get access to skills that can affect this hidden feature in various ways. This is largely moot by midway through the campaign though, as many enemies outside the bosses become pretty trivial as you get stronger. There's a dual nature to an enemy's life bar that's fun to contend with. Your normal sword attacks damage the white portion, which exposes a green bit under it. The white bar will refill unless you use your spectral attacks to damage the green portion, shortening the bar permanently. Weaving sword and claw attacks deliberately is key to efficiently dispatching your enemies. That dance can sometimes feel clunky, but racing to effectively lock in the sword damage done with some well-placed claw attacks while dodging their big moves was a major part of this combat system's unique tension against tougher enemies. Bosses themselves come in two forms: very large gimmicky pushovers and nimble progress halters. The former have more creative designs but way easier patterns to learn and avoid, making them more experiences than actual challenges. Even still, one that has you bursting plague cysts while a giant thrashes the place around you was one of the more memorable parts of Thymesia. The latter fights resemble your more standard one-on-one encounter, where a boss has a large list of possible ways to kill you quickly, and you have to dip, dodge, and deflect a lot to avoid getting mopped up. These get easier as you get stronger, but this early game card-throwing carny in particular feels like a large, thick, frustrating skill wall. Getting stronger involves the usual collecting of a currency from enemies and spending it to raise stats like health and damage, but you'll also collect and enhance plague weapons, secondary attacks that mimic the armaments your enemies will use against you. These weapons give you powerful abilities to vary your offense, like big heavy hammer blows or a quick and accurate bow. Most interestingly, you can steal a one-time use version of plague weapons from enemies, giving you yet another layer of offense on the fly. This was especially great for elite enemies and bosses, who usually have powerful abilities at their disposal. The talent tree can also tweak Corvus's moves or change them completely, though only to a certain extent. Talent points are scarce, so making good choices is key to turning you into a true killing machine. I leaned into the abilities that gave me offensive buffs when I dodged attacks at the last second or extended my normal and claw attack combos. That said, most options modify your play with passive enhancements or added utility rather than changing combat more substantially. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does limit the scope of what's possible. For example, folks who love strength-focused, big weapon smash builds will be left wanting here. Thymesia's solid kernel of an amnesiac plague warrior premise never pops into a worthwhile story. Its most creative locations and monsters are impressive, but they're also sandwiched between mundanity. Even its best feature, the kinetic combat, is satisfying only if you're willing to narrow your playstyle to a relatively small window of options. If you generally find yourself looking for more off-the-wall and expressive ways to play action games like this, you'll probably be disappointed here. But Thymesia's aggressive flavor of combat can still be an enjoyable experience, even if it's not a groundbreaking one. For more, check out our reviews of Cult of the Lamb and Xenoblade Chronicles 3. And for everything else, stick with IGN.